page 50. Bean, Essays on UG Krishnamurti and Other Topics, by Narayana, 2009. Chapter 5. Science and Spirituality. Any points of contact? Part 1. The Teachings of UG Krishnamurti. A case study, paper presented at the Krishnamurti Centennial Conference held at Miami University, Oxford, Ohio, USA, May 18 to 21, 1995. The following paper discusses some issues commonly raised in regard to the relationship between science and spirituality. In particular, I wish to examine the issue of the apparent similarities, or symmetry, between statements made by scientists and those made by mystics concerning the unity of existence, or of the universe. I shall argue that the positions of the scientists and those of the mystics are not comparable, and I wish to propose that the very premise that the mystic or the scientist has any sort of experience or knowledge of a state of unity, especially when seen in the light of the teachings of UG Krishnamurti, a contemporary teacher, is questionable. I shall include in my discussion references to a few well-known contemporary scientists, for example, David Bohm, Rupert Sheldrake and Stephen Hawking. In addition, I shall use some statements of UG Krishnamurti as a reference point, and I will raise some questions concerning his statements as well. I shall also discuss the issue of the survival of the soul after the death of the physical body and compare the views of Rupert Sheldrake and UG Krishnamurti. To complete my account of UG, I shall report some of his views which are more or less relevant to science and its methods and conclusions, as well as make some remarks as to how UG functions in day-to-day life without the burden of thought. I shall conclude my paper with some of my own remarks on UG and his teachings. UG Krishnamurti, referred to in the rest of this paper as UG, as that is how he is addressed by those who know him personally, is not only quite radical in his teaching, but he also makes constant remarks about the radical transformation he had undergone in 1967, when he was 49 years old. He was 76 at the time of writing this paper, and about the altered way he currently functions in day-to-day life. Whatever changes he went through at the time of his transformation made him free from the stranglehold of thought, and in some sense he is selfless or mindless. His remarks about the way his body functions, the manner in which his perceptions, visual or otherwise, occur, and his remarks about other matters, are quite pertinent to the topic of this paper. Also his remarks about the possibility, or rather the impossibility, of understanding the universe or of having any experience of unity generally attributed to the mystics question many of our own assumptions in this area. 5.1. Religion, of which spirituality is considered an essential aspect, has in the past come into conflict with some of the theories and conclusions of science. Three major areas of conflict are, the time of creation, the manner of creation, and the constitution of the human being, particularly with regard to the question of whether there is anything in the human being, such as the soul, that survives the death of his physical body. The most conspicuous instance of this conflict is that between creationism and evolution. Most people, at least those who are not totally committed to the teachings of the Bible, or Quran, consider the conflict settled in favor of science. As to the first of these concerns, that is, the age of creation, again, unless one is a total and literal believer in the Bible, one would have to agree with the current teachings of science that the beginnings of the universe lay in a much more remote past than 3000 BC. Some religions, in particular Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, and perhaps also Confucianism, have, at least sometimes, claimed to have no particular conflict with science, particularly in the areas of age, origins and manner of creation. Hinduism, for instance, is quite compatible with the idea of evolution, although it would allow that creation takes place out of some primeval matter at the beginning of each cycle of creation sustenance dissolution. It has its own version of evolution, which agrees with the scientific theory that evolution is from the simple to the complex and from the homogeneous to the heterogeneous. It would also rather vaguely agree that the age of the universe is, say, some billions of years. In whatever manner these issues are settled between religion and science, there is another area of contact between the two which seems more attractive and amenable to mutual interest and investigation, and that is the interface between science and spirituality. The points of contact here seem to be much closer and more intimate. Ren Copyright Weber, in her dialogues with sages and scientists, maintains that both the scientist and the mystic seek unity in the universe or reality. A parallel principle derives both science and mysticism, the assumption that unity lies at the heart of our world and that it can be discovered and experienced by man. Weber, p. 13. While the scientist, according to her, approaches the question of unity through his scientific method and reasoning, the mystic approaches it through self-knowledge. While the methodology of science is quantitative and mathematical, the methodology of mysticism is meditational. Weber, p. 8. Weber admits, however, that there are other differences between science and mysticism. Scientific method is cognitive and analytical. It studies the universe piecemeal. It claims its results to be objective and value-free. Weber, p. 8. The mystic's unity is experiential, it is union with the infinite, for instance, the Thou art it of the Upanishads. Weber, p. 9. While the scientist seeks to unify, he leaves himself out of this equation. Weber, p. 10, in spite of the fact that in quantum mechanics the observer and the observed are admitted to constitute a unit. According to Weber, the scientific community has not yet caught up with the full meaning of this declaration. Weber, p. 10. The search for the singularity before time, as in the physical theories of Stephen Hawking, is an expression of this search for unity, just as the super-implicate order in David Bohm is another such expression. Professor Bohm claims that the quantum mechanical field theory implies some such notion as his super-implicate order. Weber, pp. 34, 37. In his view, the relationship between what he calls the super-implicate order and implicate order is similar to the relationship between consciousness and matter. They are two aspects of one process. Weber, p. 38. Bohm disputes other physicists who claim that his theories do not have much scientific value because they do not yield any empirically predictable results. Yet he claims that his theory is not mere speculation but is implied by present quantum mechanics if you look at it imaginatively. Weber, p. 37. But when he is asked the question of whether there is any super-implicate order, he answers that we can't grasp that in thought. We're not saying that any of this is another word for God. I would put it another way, people had insight in the past about a form of intelligence that had organized the universe and they personalized it and called it God. A similar insight can prevail today without personalizing it and without calling it a personal God. Weber, p. 39. Bohm observes that Sheldrake, a biologist, admits that the evidence for the latter's morphogenetic fields is very limited and requires a lot of experimentation. Weber, p. 96. His own and Sheldrake's theories are about as testable as any other theories. There is no way to disprove a hypothesis of this level of generality, although it's possible to conceive of evidence accumulating which would make it look unlikely. As far as the implicate order is concerned, since that's even more general, it would be much harder to discuss evidence. The only evidence I can present is that it's a way of looking at the subject which brings it all together. And I think it has a promise of being truthful. Weber, p. 96. Bohm disputes the scientific idea that the ability of a theory to predict and control nature proves its truth. It merely proves that we can turn this crank and get the right answers in a certain area. If you restrict yourself to these areas, your theory naturally appears unassailable. Weber, p. 105. In general, both Bohm and Sheldrake seem to embrace the idea that the universe ultimately developed out of some sort of consciousness or intelligence. They both deny that either matter or mechanism explain nature and the universe. They both believe that meaning, mathematics for David Bohm, and order are part of nature and that we can study that order through mathematics or scientific theory. And yet, Bohm clearly gives the idea that thought is incapable of grasping the ultimate origins of the universe, because previous scientists, like Poincaré copyright Hess or Einstein, didn't know what the source of their mathematics was, and therefore they called it mysterious. Weber p. 147. It is Bohm's view that, inasmuch as he is studying the mathematical order of the universe, and inasmuch as mathematics is meaning and meaning is a property of consciousness, the scientist is ultimately, like the mystic, studying consciousness. In some ways the pure mathematician is going into one of the aspects of consciousness. Weber, p. 149. He says that although the scientist is inspired by the experience of matter, nevertheless once it has entered consciousness he is trying to find something that goes on in consciousness which has an order of its own. Weber, p. 149. Physicists like Hawking, although critical of the speculative fancies of scientists like Bohm, do, on grounds that their theories are not falsifiable in Karl Popper's sense, Weber, p. 210, admit that most of theoretical physics is connected with an urge to understand the universe, rather than with any practical applications, because we already know enough to deduce practical applications. Hawking admits that the theories about the laws governing the four fields are not consistent, although they are all adequate to predict more or less what will happen in most normal situations. Weber, p. 210. They differ at the level of predicting very high energies, energies much higher than we can simulate. We require physical theories to be consistent, thus we require nature to be consistent. Hawking also thinks that time and space and everything else are really in us. They are just mathematical models that we've made to describe the universe. Consequently, Hawking says that the distinction between studying nature and merely our models of nature is not a meaningful distinction. Thus it's clear from the ideas presented above that the difference between scientists like Hawking and scientists like Bohm is only a matter of degree, not of kind. They both would like to arrive at an understanding of the universe. And both are interested in arriving at a theoretical understanding of the universe which aims at unity. Both rely on reasoning and thought, even though Bohm, due to his inclinations toward mysticism, admits that thought is incapable of understanding ultimate reality. Both would go beyond merely experimental predictability. The difference between the two seems to be that Hawking would restrict himself to reconciling the conflicts in the various scientific theories concerning the fundamental fields, whereas Bohm would want to go further and try to understand the theories and achieve a unity beyond current physical theory. According to Weber, the mystic, on the other hand, is engaged in splitting his self-centered ego and the three-dimensional thinker that sustains it. Weber, p. 11, he, in changing himself, changes the subtle matter within in some radical way for which no scientific explanation is at present adequate. Weber, p. 12. For the mystic, a theory cannot comprehend reality, for it puts limits on the unbounded. Weber, p. 14. The questions of the whys and the wherefores of the universe lead, for the mystic, to the idea that the universe originates in consciousness. Weber, p. 15. Subtle matter gives birth to and governs dense matter, but all matter forms a continuum. At its most subtle and inward point, if there is such an end point, matter and consciousness become indistinguishable. Weber, p. 15. Professor Weber thinks that this subtle matter can be approached through non-ordinary states of consciousness as experienced, for instance, in Tibetan Buddhism. Weber, p. 15. A traditional meditation in Tibetan Buddhism enables the meditator to experience the unity of space, matter, and consciousness. Weber, p. 16. Regardless of Bohm's and Hawking's statements that they only study models in physics, that, in other words, the physicist is merely studying himself, that is, the mathematical models in his mind, rather than reality itself, it is clear that in some fashion the study does not and in principle cannot include the scientists themselves. It's not just that theoretical physics, as Weber claims, has not yet somehow come to understand the implications of quantum mechanics. It is not even that, as the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics states, we do not actually study reality, but only our interpretation of reality. It's just that no matter what theory a physicist arrives at, it must, as a theory, preclude the person of the scientist as part of the unity. A theory is a thought, and as a thought, it must preclude the thinker. It is precisely this separation that the mystic is trying to transcend. It is merely a concession on Bohm's part to mysticism when he says that thought cannot reach reality or that the physicist studies consciousness. These statements made by him are not consistent with his being a physicist, for they are not compatible with science or its method, particularly its rationality. For a teacher like UG, on the other hand, what is problematical is not only that our theories of the universe, of space and time, of causation, or of evolution are merely our interpretations of reality, but also that the self, of the scientist, from the scientist's point of view, is itself a product of the putting together, in the mind of the scientist, of various sensations or memories through his thought. In that sense, the self or the subject who does the scientific study, and who is normally taken for granted, is himself an interpretation. The mystic, in his turn, inasmuch as he is a mystic, is more interested in what Weber calls union with reality. Such a union may result in transcending one's sense of separation, a transcendence which the mystic had been seeking through his methods of self-knowledge and meditation. However, the mystic's pronouncements concerning his experiential discovery of the unity of existence, of the universe, or of Godhead are not in any way comparable to the physicist's theories of the universe, for the mystic's statements have no scientific, that is to say, publicly verifiable, or falsifiable, content, as do the scientists. It is true that in some sense both the scientist and the mystic do seek unity. Perhaps the very search for understanding is born out of a sense of separation which is caused by one's thought processes, and which presents, in one's consciousness, the clear separation between oneself as the observer and the world, including oneself, inasmuch as one is aware of oneself as a being in the world, as the observed. But there is a fundamental difference in the approaches. The scientist is not satisfied with a mere experience of unity, whatever that experience may consist of, but seeks unification in theory. The mystic, on the contrary, is sure that no theory will ever result in a unifying experience. Furthermore, when the mystic does experience such a unity, the quest for unity will no longer be there. Not only the quest is gone, but the seeker is gone in a very fundamental sense. It is in this context that UG's teachings have relevance. UG says that the basic questions concerning the universe or ourselves, or reality, if that's what you call it, and, we may add, questions about the meaning of life, are the self. And these questions try to maintain themselves as the self. And, moreover, they do not allow for any complete answer, for the answer would put an end to the questioner. In fact, the same thought process which created the original separation between the thinker and the world would endlessly keep asking further questions about whatever answer is given. Furthermore, and this goes quite contrary to many mystical traditions, UG says there cannot be any experience of unity or union with reality. According to him, a claim to any experience presupposes not only an awareness of the experience as an object, but also recognition of it as an experience. And these conditions are enough to destroy any possibility of there being a unity, let alone an experience of unity, because any recognition implies a duality or division between the subject and the object. How can there be an experience of unity where there is a subject left out of the object of experience? Is it possible that there is indeed an experience of unity, but when the experience occurs, there is no awareness of it, yet it could be recalled as such sometime later? UG denies that such a possibility exists, because, in order for there to be a memory of an experience, there has to have been an initial experience, or knowledge, with an awareness which implies a subject-object distinction. In other words, he denies that it is possible to have an experience without a subject-object distinction. Were it possible to have such an experience, he denies that we could have a memory of it. When there is no such distinction, as should be the case with the so-called experience of unity, there can be no recognition of that state, and therefore the state does not constitute an experience, and for that reason there can be no memory of it later. Nevertheless, when UG describes his own process of death or thoughtless state, he admits that there must be in that state some awareness of what was going on, or he would not be able to talk about it. This admission leads us to wonder whether, after all, UG is not concurring with scientists like Sheldrake and Bohm in their assertion that consciousness is the ultimate reality and is the unity of the universe. UG's admission would be somewhat akin to that of the scientists in another sense also, namely, that it is somewhat speculative, although perhaps not to him, for in the awareness of his own thoughtless state there must be some thought operating, according to his own admission, or else he would not be able to report about it, and his statement about consciousness being everywhere would, therefore, also be somewhat speculative. He may have superior knowledge, superior to what we have, in this matter, but, to us, his statements expressing such knowledge must, like the statements of the scientists, sound speculative. Is it possible, then, that when the mystic talks about the experience of unity, say, his experience of Brahman or of emptiness, that there is just a unity of consciousness, let us say, just awareness, without any awareness of that awareness, or a minimal or implicit awareness, as UG himself seems to suggest in his own case when he undergoes his experience of death or similar extraordinary experiences, see below, and that a full-blown subject-object division comes into the picture when that experience is recalled and named? In other words, is it possible that, although in the mystic the continuity of consciousness is broken up in such a way that there is no self, the continuity of consciousness or experience or memory is what creates the self, there is still a physiological lingering or trace of a previous experience? And is it possible that, although there might not be any explicit subject-object distinction at the time of experience, a memory of it becomes possible later because the physiological trace is translated at that later moment as a memory experience, and as a consequence, one recognizes and names the experience, albeit calling it nameless? It may well be that the experience now is remembered as one of formless emptiness or of energy or of ecstasy. In any case, it would be remembered as being free from any of the delineations of ordinary experience. Suppose it is possible for the mystic to experience unity in such a fashion. In what way would this unity be compared to the unity posited by the physicist? Is it not possible to interpret this unity, or the experience of it, as just the subjective, although uplifting, experience of the mystic? Does this imply that there is unity, such as of consciousness, or whatever the scientist might be speculating about, in the universe as a whole? If there is any unity in the universe in the scientific sense, then it is not something the scientist can observe, for the scientist always has to remain outside of it as the observer. And if it can be observed, then we can't know if it is the unity of the universe or not. Given such a paradox, it seems to me that the unity professed by the mystic and that professed by the scientist are not comparable. In fact, I think we got into the trap of comparing these only because of the ambiguity in the term unity. The unity for the physicist has to remain a conceptual and objective unity. And unity for the mystic has to be an experience where there is no observer, and hence there would be no distinction between objective unity and the subjective experience of it. 5.2 For UG there is no such thing as reality. Whatever our thought constructs as reality is all the reality we know or can know of. While the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics says that what we know is only our interpretation of reality, including the reality of the scientist, the interpretation does not, however, doubt the reality of the scientist who makes such an assertion. UG, on the contrary, says that the thinker, you, me or UG, are all constructs of thought. That's all we can know. And this idea is quite consistent with the general tenets of mysticism. UG merely draws the consequences of this thesis consistently. The above remarks also apply to our understanding of reality as being bound by the laws of cause and effect. Current physics, because of quantum mechanics or of Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, may revise our notions of cause and effect. UG, on the other hand, sees any attempt to relate events in terms of cause and effect, along with the attempts to understand reality, as part of the project of making the self. Causation is the self's means of controlling the world and of thus maintaining itself and its own continuity. It is more than an effective way of surviving in this world and decidedly more than a way of ordering events with a view to understanding reality. For someone like UG, then, the quest of science would reveal itself as a mere technology which delivers various products, rather than an endless attempt to understand reality. Science is valid to the extent of its results. Outside of that, according to UG, it is just an endless spinning of wheels for the purposes of the scientist's self-aggrandizement. UG, in fact, does not separate the scientist from his science. As he calls the scientist's enterprise into question, he is also calling the scientist's person into question, inasmuch as he is exposing the personal motivation behind any scientific enterprise. Just as he does with people from other walks of life, he is attempting to frustrate the self-centered efforts of the scientist in the way of self-aggrandizement. He has no positive teaching of his own in this matter, he only seeks to frustrate the efforts of the scientist, and he does not attempt to fill in that gap with any other suggestions.